The chains on Abel's hands were invisible, forged of duty and fear, but the chains on his heart were real, pulling him toward the sea. He was a master of the forge, a man whose strength could bend iron, but could it break the bonds of slavery? One smoky night in Charleston, he would risk everything for a single breath of salt air. He didn't know a secret network was watching him. He didn't know his master's cruelest secret was about to be exposed. And he didn't know that his escape would ignite a fire that would threaten to burn down the whole city. But as he stood at the crossroads of bondage and freedom, one question burned brighter than any forge. Could a man truly disappear into smoke? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The year was 1836, and the air in Master Croft's Charleston smithy was a thick, suffocating stew you could taste. It was a foul broth of coal smoke, human sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of tortured iron. Its only seasoning was the rhythmic, deafening clang of hammer on anvil, a brutal heartbeat that pulsed from before dawn until long after dusk. This was Abel Turner's world, a world of fire and force. He was a man built on a scale that seemed to defy the cramped confines of the smithy, his shoulders a wide yoke of muscle, his arms thick as oak limbs. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency, his movements a symphony of contained power honed by a decade of relentless, soul-crushing labor. Every swing of his hammer was precise, every pull on the bellows a measured breath feeding the forge's glowing heart. There was no wasted motion, for waste was a luxury he could not afford. He was finishing an ornate iron gate, a commission of staggering complexity, its design a dizzying web of scrolls and rosettes meant to guard the entrance to some wealthy merchant's garden. It was delicate work for a place of such brute force, requiring a surgeon's touch with a blacksmith's tools. Abel was a master of this paradox, his massive hands capable of coaxing the most intricate patterns from glowing steel. Master Croft, a man whose face seemed permanently chiseled into a mask of sour dissatisfaction, loomed behind him. Croft was a slight man, his presence not one of physical intimidation, but of pervasive, corrosive authority. He watched Abel's every move, his lips a thin, bloodless line. "Faster, Abel," Croft's voice cut through the din, sharp and grating. "The tide waits for no man, and neither does my client. That scrollwork is clumsy, the curve is not uniform. Do it again." Abel's jaw tightened, a subtle shift of muscle in his soot-stained face, the only outward sign of the inferno roaring within him. He did not speak. Words were a currency he rarely spent, for they were too often twisted and used against him. Silence was his armor. He offered a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes fixed on the imperfection only Croft's hypercritical gaze could find. With a grunt, he used the heavy tongs to return the intricate section to the forge's incandescent core, the metal hissing as it surrendered to the heat. His silence was a dam holding back a flood of rage, a response far more potent than any curse he could have uttered. This oppressive dance was their daily ritual, a constant reinforcement of the invisible chains that bound him. Croft's cruelty was directly proportional to the value of the work. And this gate, this masterpiece of iron lace, was the most valuable commission the smithy had ever undertaken. It made Abel indispensable and therefore a target for his master's deepest insecurities. The heat of the forge was a physical manifestation of his own simmering fury. He watched the sparks dance and die, each one a fleeting moment of brilliance before it turned to ash. Sweat carved clean paths through the grime on his skin, tracing the contours of a face set like stone. In those moments when his mind could drift from the heat and the hammer, it flew to the sea. On a good day, a strong easterly wind would carry the scent of salt and brine from the harbor, a torturous and tantalizing promise of a world beyond the smoke and soot of Charleston. It was the scent of freedom. While the iron for the gate softened in the fire, Abel's eyes fell upon a small piece of scrap steel. In a few swift, secret movements, hidden from Croft's view by the bulk of his own body, he took the piece to a corner of the anvil. With deft, quiet taps of a smaller hammer, he began to shape it, not into a leaf or a scroll, but into the unmistakable silhouette of a seabird, its wings outstretched in perpetual flight. After dusk, the world shrank to the cramped, bleak confines of the slave quarters. The cacophony of the city and the forge was muffled here, replaced by the quiet sighs and weary murmurs of the exhausted. It was a place of shared suffering, a fragile community bound by the common yoke of bondage. Abel sat on his simple cot, a rough-hewn plank of wood with a thin straw mattress, meticulously cleaning the day's grime from his hands and from beneath his fingernails. Ilara, an older woman whose eyes held the wisdom and weariness of 1,000 sorrows, moved silently toward him. She carried a small wooden bowl of thin, watery stew, the evening's meager ration. She was the closest thing to a mother he had ever known, her presence a small, steady comfort in the crushing darkness. As she handed him the bowl, her gaze fell upon the small iron bird he was turning over and over in his palm, its sharp edges softened by the constant touch of his skin. He tried to hide it, a reflexive, guilty motion, but it was too late. The sea, she sings a sweet song, Abel. Ilara's voice was low, a raspy whisper that held the weight of years. But she also sings of sorrow. Don't let her tune drown out the sound of the patrol's boots. Her words were not a scolding, but a plea, born of a deep, abiding love and a paralyzing fear for the boy she had watched grow into a man of dangerous dreams. Abel's gaze lifted from the iron bird to meet hers. His own voice was rough, unused. "Sometimes, Ilara," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "I think drowning would be better than burning." The depth of his despair hung in the air between them, a chasm that her love could not bridge. He saw the pain in her eyes, the reflection of his own hopelessness, and knew his yearning for escape was a wound he inflicted not just on himself, but on those who cared for him. The quiet, shadowed quarters and the loud, fiery Smithy were the two poles of his existence, one a slow, cold suffocation, the other a trial by fire. He was trapped between them, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. The city slept, but the forge did not. Master Croft, driven by the deadline for the gate and the immense pressure from his client, had forced Abel to work through the night. The rhythmic clang of the hammer was a lonely, defiant sound in the sleeping city, a testament to one man's greed and another's endurance. Abel worked in a trance of exhaustion, his muscles screaming, his mind numb. The fire in the forge breathed in and out, a great glowing lung in the darkness, its fiery breath painting his sweating skin in demonic hues of orange and red. As he worked, a shower of sparks, larger and more violent than usual, belched from the chimney flue. He had seen it happen 1,000 times, the sparks dying harmlessly on the damp night air. But tonight the air was dry, and a stray gust of wind carried the glowing embers toward the roof of a nearby storage shed. Abel saw it. A single bright spark landed on the dry, weathered shingles, glowed for a moment like a malevolent eye, and then, with a soft whoosh, blossomed into a tiny, hungry flame. He froze, the heavy hammer still in his hand. His face, illuminated by the steady glow of the forge fire on one side and the new, flickering, growing blaze on the other, was a mask of conflict. He could shout, raise the alarm, and be the hero who saved his master's property. Or he could be silent. The hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, a single suspended heartbeat in the deep of the night. In that moment, a decision was made. A lifetime of passive defiance, of silent glares and tightened jaws, coalesced into a single active choice. He turned away from the growing fire. With a surge of adrenaline that banished his exhaustion, he worked with a renewed, frantic energy. But his attention was no longer on the ornate gate. He grabbed the bellows and began to pump, not to heat the iron, but to stoke the forge fire into a raging inferno, to create more smoke, more chaos, more cover. The fire inside him had finally found its expression in the world outside. Dawn broke cold and gray over Charleston. Master Croft arrived at the smithy, his mood already foul, expecting to find an exhausted slave and a nearly finished gate. Instead, he found the smithy door swinging gently on its hinges, creaking a mournful rhythm in the morning breeze. An eerie silence hung in the air, the familiar comforting roar of the forge conspicuously absent. The fire was dead, a mound of gray ash and cold iron. His eyes darted to the side, where the storage shed was now a smoldering, blackened ruin. The fire had been contained to the one small building, but it had clearly served its purpose. Croft's gaze snapped back to the anvil, the heart of the smithy. There, his heavy leather apron, the symbol of his servitude, was neatly folded. It was a deliberate, final statement, an act of dignity, not the sign of a panicked flight. And next to it, gleaming in the pale morning light, lay the iron gate. It was perfect. The clumsy scrollwork was gone, replaced by a flawless uniform curve. Every leaf, every rosette was finished to an impossible standard. He had fulfilled his final task, but on his own terms. Croft's face, normally a mask of simple anger, contorted with something new. It was not just the fury of a man who had lost his most valuable piece of property. It was panic, a cold, creeping dread that had nothing to do with the $500 reward he would soon post and everything to do with the secrets that had just walked out his door. The air in the smithy was thick with the smell of cold smoke and faintly, unmistakably, the clean, sharp scent of salt from the sea. He did not run. To run was to confess guilt, to attract the eye, to invite the chase. Abel walked. He walked from the familiar hell of the forge and straight into the churning, acrid chaos he had helped nurture. The smoke from the burning shed was a thick, rolling beast, a living entity that swallowed the night. It clawed at his throat and stung his eyes, but it was also his salvation, a billowing cloak of invisibility. He pulled the collar of his rough-spun shirt up over his nose and mouth, his lungs burning with every measured breath. and stepped into the gray oblivion. The world dissolved into a pandemonium of shouts and flickering lights. Men ran past him, their faces panicked in the glow of the flames, their voices swallowed by the roar and the crackle of the fire. No one saw the large, soot-stained figure moving with deliberate calm against the current of chaos. He was just another shadow in a world made of them. For years his world had been the forge, the quarters, and the short, supervised path between them. But in his mind he had walked every inch of Charleston. On his rare errands, he had not just seen the streets, he had memorized them, charting a mental map of every back alley, every narrow passage, every shadowed doorway. He had observed the patterns of the city watch, the habits of the slave patrols, the rhythm of life and death in the city's hidden arteries. Now that silent, obsessive cartography became his guide. He moved with the instinct of a hunter, not the panic of the hunted, his large frame melting into the labyrinth. He slipped through a narrow gap between a cooper's shop and a chandlery, the air suddenly cool and damp, smelling of wet wood and wax. The roar of the fire receded, replaced by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his heart, a drumbeat of terror and fragile, electrifying hope. Every shadow seemed to hold a patrolman's uniform. Every distant shout sounded like his own name being called. The smoke was his shield, but it was also a suffocating danger, a constant reminder of the fire he had left behind, a fire that could either save him or condemn him. He pressed on, a ghost moving through a city of ghosts, his every sense screaming with a hyper-awareness that was both a torment and a lifeline. He reached the designated meeting point, a dead-end alley behind a fish market, the ground slick with scales and brine. He flattened himself into the deep shadow of a rain barrel, his body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. He waited. For how long he couldn't be sure. It could have been minutes or an eternity. Just as a sliver of despair began to pierce his resolve, a shape detached itself from the deeper darkness at the alley's end. It was a boy, no more than 12, with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. The boy said nothing. He simply gave a short, sharp nod and turned, beckoning Abel to follow. They moved like whispers through the sleeping city, the boy's small, silent form leading the way until they stopped before a respectable-looking seamstress shop on a quiet, tree-lined street. The boy pointed to the back door, gave another single solemn nod, and vanished as silently as he had appeared. Abel pushed the door open. It was unlocked. He stepped inside and the door clicked shut behind him, the sound as final as a cell door closing. The room was small, hidden, and smelled overwhelmingly of lavender and lye soap. A clean, sharp scent so alien to his senses that it made him dizzy. A woman stood by a small table, a single candle illuminating her face. She was a free black woman, her posture erect, her dress immaculate. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and held a calmness that seemed impossible in the midst of the city's turmoil. This was Sarah. She looked him over, her gaze missing nothing, from the soot on his skin to the raw burn on his forearm where a stray ember had landed. She gestured to a stool. "Sit," she said, her voice low and even. She brought him a dipper of cool water, which he drank in 3 long, desperate gulps. Without a word, she took a clean cloth and began to gently clean the burn, her touch firm and professional. When she was done, she looked him directly in the eye. "You are a ghost now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Ghosts don't have names and they don't make a sound. Master Croft is turning the city upside down. You will stay here until the dust settles." A profound sense of relief washed over Abel, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. But it was mixed with a dizzying disorientation. For the first time in his life, he was not in control of his own body, not subject to a master's command, but to a stranger's protection. He had to place his life, his very existence, into the hands of people he did not know. The quiet, orderly room with its neatly stacked bolts of fabric and the clean, almost sterile air was the absolute antithesis of the fiery chaos of the forge and the desperate flight through the alleys. He was a creature of fire and iron, and he had stumbled into a sanctuary of lavender and linen. He simply nodded, his throat too tight for words, and surrendered to the silence she commanded. While Abel sat in the silent, hidden room, Master Croft's rage was tearing Charleston apart. His initial panic had curdled into a venomous, desperate fury. This was not merely the loss of property, it was a personal affront, a deep and public humiliation. He unleashed the full force of his power and his purse. He hired 2 additional teams of slave catchers, ruthless men with hungry dogs and colder eyes, promising them a bonus on top of the reward. Handbills began to appear on every corner, every tavern door, every public post. They bore a crude woodcut likeness of Abel, capturing his size but none of his spirit, and a description of the brand on his shoulder. And below it the promise of a reward that made men stop and stare. $500. The sum was a testament to Croft's desperation, a fortune that could tempt even a man with a conscience. The city, which had been a labyrinth of escape for Abel, now felt like a closing trap. Patrols were doubled, their boots echoing on the cobblestones with a new aggressive urgency. They searched the docks, the taverns, the free black neighborhoods, their questions sharp and their methods brutal. Croft himself, his face a thundercloud of rage, stormed back to his own property. He lined up the handful of other slaves he owned, his eyes burning with suspicion. He questioned each of them, his voice a lash, but he saved his true venom for Alara. He cornered her in the kitchen, his face inches from hers, his spittle flying as he shouted, "He spoke to you, old woman, I know he did. Where did he go?" His voice dropped to a conspiratorial hiss, a clumsy attempt at manipulation. "Tell me, and I'll make your last years easy. A warm spot by the fire, the best food from my own table." Ilara met his gaze without flinching. Her face, a roadmap of sorrow and endurance, became a mask of weary, unassailable ignorance. She did not look away. She did not tremble. She simply stood, a frail, unmovable rock against his storm of fury. "He spoke of iron and fire, master," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "Same as always. Know nothing about the sea." Her quiet defiance was a mirror of Abel's own, a strength forged in the same fires of oppression. Croft saw the truth in her eyes, the truth that she would rather die than betray the boy she loved as a son. And it enraged him further. He stormed out, his threats and curses hanging in the air, leaving Alara standing alone, her heart aching with fear and a fierce, terrible pride. Days bled into one another in the hidden room. Abel lost track of time. his world defined by the slivers of light that crept through the floorboards from the shop above and the quiet, efficient movements of Sarah. She brought him food and water, changed the dressing on his burn, and spoke only when necessary. The silence was a heavy blanket, giving him too much time to think, to fear, to imagine the hunt that was consuming the city. Then one evening the door opened and Sarah entered, followed by a man Abel had never seen before. He was a white man, dressed in the simple, severe gray clothing of a Quaker. He was tall and slender, with a gentle face and eyes that held a deep, unwavering conviction. "Abel," Sarah said softly, "this is Jedediah. He is a friend." Jedediah nodded, a small, kind smile on his lips. He carried a bundle of clothes. "It is a pleasure to meet thee, friend," he said, his voice calm and soothing. He placed the bundle on the table. It was a set of plain but well-made clothes. The sturdy trousers and clean linen shirt of a free dock worker or a tradesman. "These are for you." He then sat on the stool opposite Abel, his hands resting on his knees. "Freedom is not just the absence of chains, Abel," he began, his voice gentle but firm, like a teacher instructing a favored pupil. "It is a weight you must learn to carry. It is a new language you must learn to speak, not just with your mouth, but with your entire body." Over the next hour, Jedediah began to coach him. He taught him how to walk, not with the shuffling, groundward gaze of a slave, but with a purpose, a destination. He taught him how to meet a white man's eye, not with defiance, but with the simple, neutral expectation of being seen as an equal. For Abel, this was the most terrifying hurdle. The muscle memory of a lifetime, the ingrained instinct to avert his gaze, to make himself smaller, to disappear, was a powerful force. Looking Jedediah in the eye felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. "You must have a story," Jedediah continued, his patience endless. "A reason for being, a past that is not the one you carry in your heart." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, expertly aged and creased. It was a set of freedom papers. "These are a whisper of freedom, not a shout. Use them with care, friend." He handed them to Abel, whose hands trembled as he took them. The paper felt impossibly fragile, yet held the weight of a new world. "They say your name is James," Jedediah said, his eyes locking with Abel's, forcing him to hold the gaze. "And you are a carpenter from up country, come to Charleston to find work." Abel stared at the name written on the paper. James. It was a foreign sound, a costume he was now expected to wear. He felt awkward, a fraud, an imposter in these clean clothes with this new name and this fabricated past. But as he looked from the papers in his hand to the kind, steady face of the Quaker merchant, a dawning realization began to cut through the fear. He was not just running from something, he was, with the help of these impossible strangers, beginning the terrifying sacred work of becoming someone else. "The best hiding place is often in plain sight," Jedediah had said, his voice a calm pond in the swirling river of Abel's fear. "To stay hidden in that room is to be a caged animal. To walk in the sun is to be a man. We must begin to practice." And so Abel found himself walking into the sun, a sun that felt less like a warmth and more like a spotlight. Jedediah had taken him out on the pretense of an errand, a journey to the bustling Charleston market to procure some specific thread for Sarah's work. For Abel, it was like stepping onto a different planet. The world he had known was one of narrow, prescribed paths, of downcast eyes and a constant humming awareness of his own physical presence as a thing to be managed, contained, and ignored. The market was the opposite of that. It was a riot of sensation, a chaotic symphony that assaulted him from all sides. The air was thick with 100 competing smells. The sweet rot of discarded fruit, the sharp tang of fresh fish on ice, the earthy scent of potatoes in burlap sacks, and the heady perfume of flowers being sold by a woman whose laughter rang out like bells. It was a world of noise, the haggling of vendors, the gossip of shoppers, the rumble of wagon wheels on cobblestone, the squawking of chickens in their crates. It was a world of color and movement, a dizzying tapestry of humanity that threatened to overwhelm him. He felt his shoulders instinctively hunch, his eyes wanting to drop to the ground, to trace the familiar patterns of dirt and stone. He fought the urge, the muscles in his neck straining with the effort to keep his head up. He was James, the carpenter. A carpenter looks at the world, he does not look at his feet. Jedediah walked beside him, a silent, steadying presence. He did not coddle Abel, but moved through the crowd with a calm purpose, occasionally pointing out a landmark or commenting on the price of goods, forcing Abel to engage with the world around him. They were examining a stall laden with gleaming fish, their silver scales iridescent in the sunlight, when a cold dread, primal and instantaneous, seized Abel. It was a feeling that bypassed thought and went straight to the marrow of his bones. He felt it before he saw it. Across the square, standing near the fountain, his face a thundercloud of impotent rage, was Master Croft. Abel's blood ran cold, his breath hitched in his throat. The carefully constructed facade of James the carpenter shattered into 1,000 pieces. He was Abel the runaway, Abel the property, Abel the hunted. His body reacted before his mind could, his head beginning to dip in the old subservient way, his shoulders starting to curve inward, a reflexive attempt to make his large frame smaller, less visible. The muscle memory of a lifetime of bondage was a powerful, undeniable force. Before the movement was even complete, Jedediah's hand subtly gripped his arm. The pressure was firm, not violent, but it was an anchor in the maelstrom of his terror. It was a silent, urgent reminder. You are James the carpenter. Jedediah's voice was a low, calm murmur, barely audible above the market's din. Look at the price of that fish. You are hungry. The simple, direct command cut through the panic. Hungry. James the carpenter was hungry. He was thinking about his dinner. He was not thinking about the monster across the square. Abel forced his gaze away from Croft, his eyes landing on a large red snapper laid out on a bed of ice. He stared at it, his mind a roaring void. A city patrolman, drawn by the sheer force of Croft's furious presence, ambled over to him. The patrolman exchanged a few words with Croft. Then his gaze began to sweep the square. A lazy, indifferent search. The man's eyes passed over Abel and Jedediah, lingered for a half-second, and then moved on, finding nothing of interest in a Quaker merchant and a country carpenter discussing the price of fish. The moment stretched into an eternity. Abel could feel the patrolman's gaze on his back, a physical weight. He forced himself to speak, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. Too dear, he mumbled, his voice raspy. The price is too dear. Jedediah gave his arm a slight squeeze of approval before releasing it. Indeed, friend, we will find our supper elsewhere. They turned and walked away, melting back into the anonymous river of the crowd, leaving Master Croft to his fury, a pathetic, marooned figure in the center of the square. The brief, firm pressure of Jedediah's hand had been a lifeline, pulling him back from an abyss of instinct and fear. He had survived. He had held the gaze of the world and had not been struck down. While Abel was learning the weight of freedom in the marketplace, Ilara was moving through the silent, lavish spaces of Master Croft's house. Since Abel's departure, Croft's temper, always volatile, had become a constant simmering poison. The other house slaves moved with a new level of caution, their silence deeper, their movements more furtive. Ilara, protected by her age and her long, unblemished service, was tasked with cleaning the master's study, a room usually forbidden to her. The place was a testament to Croft's vanity, filled with heavy mahogany furniture and leather-bound books he never read. But recently it had taken on an air of neglect. A fine layer of dust coated the surfaces, and an empty bottle of brandy sat accusingly on the desk. Ilara was dusting in an adjoining records room, her movements slow and methodical, when she heard the front door open and close, followed by heavy, angry footsteps. She froze, melting back into the shadows behind a tall filing cabinet. Croft entered the study, and he was not alone. The other man's voice was smooth, but with an undercurrent of menace that made the hairs on Ilara's arms stand up. "My employer's patience is at an end, Croft," the man said. There was no preamble, no greeting. The shipment is due. The gate was the centerpiece. Without it, the entire commission is void. "I will have the gate." Croft's voice was strained, defensive. "My smith, the man who forged it, he ran off. But I will find him. I have every man in the city looking for him." The visitor laughed, a short, ugly sound devoid of humor. "Your smith? You mean your slave, and you lost him. That is your problem, not ours. My employer's interests are in the timely delivery of goods, not in the management of your stock." The man's voice lowered, the silkiness replaced by cold, hard steel. "Your debts are due, Croft. You took a significant advance for the materials, an advance predicated on the completion of this work. Without that gate, your credit is worthless. Your reputation will be the least of what you lose. There are other, more direct ways of settling accounts." Ilara pressed a hand to her mouth, her heart pounding. So this was it. This was the secret behind the frantic, obsessive push to finish the gate. It was not just about a prestigious commission. It was about Croft's own financial and social ruin. He had overextended himself, staked his entire fortune on Abel's skill, and now the bill was coming due. The iron gate was not just a gate. It was the keystone holding up the entire crumbling edifice of Master Croft's life. This knowledge made him infinitely more dangerous. A master's pride was a fearsome thing, but a desperate man's fear was a force of nature. A cold, grim satisfaction settled in Ilara's heart as she listened to her master squirm, but it was quickly followed by a wave of terror. She feared what this desperation would drive him to do, not just to find Abel, but to punish anyone he suspected of helping him. She stood perfectly still, a silent witness in the shadows as the foundation of her oppressor's world began to crack. That night, Sarah and Jedediah took Abel to another part of their hidden world. They led him through a series of back alleys to a bakery. The air was warm and sweet with the smell of yeast and cooling bread. The baker, a stout German man with flour in his eyebrows, nodded to them grimly and led them to a heavy trap-door hidden beneath a stack of empty flour sacks. He opened it to reveal a steep set of stone steps leading down into a damp, cool cellar. The air below smelled of earth and ink. In the center of the small, cramped space, illuminated by a single lantern, was a small, portable printing press. It was surrounded by stacks of paper and tins of black ink. This was one of the hearts of the network, a place where abolitionist pamphlets and forged freedom papers were born. "We have a problem, Abel," Sarah said, her voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber. She pointed to a small, intricate metal part sitting on a nearby crate. It was a lever of some kind, and it had snapped in two. "This piece is critical. Without it, the press is useless. We have been unable to find a smith in the city that we can trust with such a repair. To ask the wrong person would be to expose us all." The unspoken question hung in the air. They looked at him, their faces a mixture of hope and hesitation. They were asking him to return to the fire, to pick up the tools of his own bondage and use them for their cause. Abel walked over and picked up the two pieces of broken metal. He turned them over in his hands, his calloused fingertips immediately recognizing the feel of the steel, the nature of the break, the stress points that had caused it to fail. For weeks he had looked at his hands and seen only the symbols of his servitude. They were things that had belonged to Master Croft, tools for another man's profit. But now, holding the broken pieces of the press, he felt a flicker of something else. He looked around the cellar. In a corner there was a small makeshift forge, little more than a heavy iron basin filled with charcoal and a small hand-cranked bellows. It was a pathetic thing compared to the roaring monster he had commanded in Croft's smithy, but the principle was the same. "I can fix it," he said, his voice certain. A look of profound relief passed between Sarah and Jedediah. The baker brought him a small hammer and a pair of tongs. Abel arranged the charcoal in the basin, and as he cranked the bellows, a small, bright fire bloomed in the darkness of the cellar. The glow felt different from the forge he had known. That fire had been a fire of oppression, its heat a constant suffocating weight. This fire was small, secret, and defiant. It was a fire of rebellion. He carefully placed the two broken pieces into the heart of the flames. When they glowed a bright cherry red, he took them to a small flat stone that served as an anvil. The first time his hammer struck the glowing metal, the sound rang through the small cellar. It was the same sound that had dominated his entire life, the clang of hammer on steel. But the feeling was entirely new. This was his skill, his strength, his fire. He was not working under the threat of a lash, but for the hope of freedom. He was not creating an object of vanity for a rich man's garden. He was forging a link in the chain of liberation. A surge of purpose, clean and powerful, washed through him. He worked with a focused passion he had never known, his movements precise and economical, his entire being poured into the simple act of mending what was broken. His hands, which he had begun to see as his shame, had become his contribution. He was no longer just a passenger on this underground railroad, he was helping to lay the tracks. 2 nights later, Jedediah returned to the seamstress's shop. He found Abel in the back room, sitting in the near darkness, the silence broken only by the sound of Sarah's needle moving through cloth in the room above. Jedediah's face, usually so placid, was alight with a suppressed excitement. "The window is open, Abel," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He sat down, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "I have secured passage for you, on a northbound merchant ship. She is called the North Star." The name itself was a jolt of hope, a powerful symbol of guidance out of the darkness. Abel leaned forward, his heart beginning to pound a heavy, hopeful rhythm. "The captain is a man named Silas," Jedediah continued. "He is a hard man, but a fair one. He owes me a significant debt of gratitude from a business dealing some years ago, a debt he has agreed to repay by taking on a single silent passenger. The ship will sail in 3 nights' time on the evening tide." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "There is more. A coastal storm is predicted to move in that night. The timing is a blessing and a curse." Abel understood immediately. The storm would provide the perfect cover, its chaos and fury driving the patrols from the streets and masking their movements. But it would also make the journey to the docks treacherous and the voyage itself a trial. "The window is small, Abel," Jedediah said, his gaze steady and searching. "The storm will provide cover, but it will also be a trial. The sea gives, but it also takes. Are you ready?" Abel thought of the market, of the terror of seeing Croft and the quiet strength he had found in Jedediah's grip. He thought of the cellar, of the feel of the hammer in his hand, of the defiant glow of the small forge. He thought of the mended press part, a solid piece of steel that he had made whole again. He was no longer just a passive recipient of help, a piece of cargo being moved from one place to another. He was a part of this now, an active participant in his own liberation. He reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around a small, smooth object. It was a piece of scrap metal he had taken from the cellar, and in the long, silent hours he had worked it with a file, shaping it into the familiar form of a seabird, its wings outstretched. He clutched the small metal totem, its solidity a comfort in his palm. He met Jedediah's gaze, his own eyes clear and resolved. "I am," he said. And for the first time the words felt entirely true. The final moments in the seamstress's shop were heavy with a silence that felt louder than any storm. Abel stood in the small back room, dressed in the rough, durable clothes of a dockhand. The fabric was coarse against his skin, a physical reminder of the new identity he was about to fully inhabit. James the carpenter was gone, replaced by James the laborer, another anonymous face seeking passage or a day's wage by the sea. Sarah stood before him, the candlelight casting deep shadows on her face, making her sharp, intelligent eyes seem even brighter. She had done so much, risked everything for him, a stranger who had stumbled out of the smoke, and he had no words sufficient to thank her. His throat was tight with a knot of unspoken gratitude and sorrow. She seemed to understand. She reached out not to touch him, but to press a small, light object into his palm. Abel looked down. It was a seabird crudely carved from a piece of pale driftwood, its wings arched in a familiar, hopeful sweep. It was almost identical in shape to the iron one he had forged in secret, the one he had lost in his flight. Sarah's gaze was steady. "I found the other one when I mended your old clothes," she said softly, her voice a quiet anchor in the rising wind he could hear outside. "I thought you should have something to carry with you on your journey." She closed his fingers over the small wooden bird. "Fly far, Abel. And when you land, build a nest strong enough for others." The simple words were a charge, a blessing, and a burden all at once. He was not just escaping for himself, he was escaping for them, for the hope they represented. He was a vessel for their courage. He looked from the bird in his hand to her unwavering face, and all he could do was nod. A single sharp movement of his head, hoping she could see the lifetime of thanks he could not speak. A tear he did not know he had shed traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. Sarah simply smiled, a small, sad, beautiful smile, and then turned to the door, opening it just enough for him to slip out into the night where Jedediah was waiting. The storm was not just a prediction. It was a living, breathing monster that had seized Charleston in its jaws. The wind howled through the narrow streets like a vengeful spirit, a physical force that shoved and tore at them. Rain, driven almost horizontal, fell in blinding silver sheets, instantly soaking them to the bone. Jedediah led the way, his lean frame bent against the gale, his face grim and determined. They moved through the back alleys, the familiar labyrinth that had first guided Abel to freedom, now a treacherous, waterlogged obstacle course. The city was a landscape of violent motion and terrifying sound. Lanterns swung wildly from their posts, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like demons. Shutters torn from their latches slammed against brick walls with the report of gunshots. The roar of the wind was a constant, deafening presence, punctuated by the groaning of buildings and the high-pitched shriek of tortured wood and metal. For Abel, the storm was both ally and enemy. It was a cloak, its fury providing a cover more absolute than any darkness. The deluge would wash away their tracks. The wind would swallow the sound of their footsteps, and the sheer misery of the weather would keep the patrols huddled in whatever shelter they could find. But it was also a relentless adversary. The cobblestones were slick and treacherous, and the alleys had become shallow, fast-moving rivers of filth and debris. The cold was a physical blow seeping into his bones, and the force of the wind made every step a struggle. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that was part terror and part the sheer physical exertion of moving through the tempest. He kept his head down, the brim of his borrowed hat pulled low, his world reduced to the sight of Jedediah's back and the churning water at his own feet. He clutched the wooden bird in his pocket, its smooth, simple shape a single point of focus, a tangible piece of the quiet, candle-lit room in the midst of the world's violent chaos. They reached the edge of the docks, a sprawling, skeletal world of piers and cranes, now rendered almost invisible by the sheeting rain and the churning darkness. The air was thick with the smell of salt, tar, and wet wood. The roar of the wind was joined by a new sound here, the deep, percussive boom of waves crashing against the pilings and the high, mournful cry of rigging being whipped by the gale. Jedediah pointed through the gloom. "There!" he shouted, his voice nearly stolen by the wind. "Pier 4. That is where the North Star is berthed." Abel could just make out the shape of a ship, its masts swaying violently against the bruised, light-polluted sky. It seemed an impossible distance away. As they prepared to leave the relative cover of a warehouse wall, a flicker of light from a different pier further down the wharf caught Abel's eye. He froze, his hand shooting out to grab Jedediah's arm. His blood ran cold. A group of men, their figures made monstrous by the swinging, erratic light of their lanterns, were clustered at the head of the adjacent pier. Even through the driving rain, Abel recognized the furious, hunched posture of the man at their center. It was Master Croft. He was flanked by the hired slave catchers, their faces grim and predatory in the lantern light. They were acting on a tip that the network had planted. Sarah had told him they would send Croft on a fool's errand, a false lead to a different ship, a different pier to draw him away from their true purpose. But seeing him there so close, a physical embodiment of the hunt, was a jolt of pure heart-stopping terror. Jedediah pulled him back deeper into the deep shadow of a stack of massive cotton bales, their canvas covering shedding water in thick streams. They watched, their own breathing seeming to stop. Croft was shouting at the captain of the ship docked at that pier, his words torn away by the storm, but his enraged gestures were a clear pantomime of frustration and fury. The captain, a burly man in oilskins, simply shook his head and pointed back toward the city. The slave catchers looked restless and miserable, their dogs whining and pulling at their leashes, clearly hating the storm. After another minute of furious, pointless argument, Croft slammed his fist against a piling. He turned, his face a mask of pure rage visible for a moment in the lantern glow, and began stomping back toward the street, his hired hunters trailing behind him like jackals. He had been sent on a fool's errand, and he knew it. Abel watched his former master drenched, defeated, and pathetic disappear into the storm. A grim, cold sense of victory settled over him, a feeling that was as powerful as the terror that had preceded it. Seeing Croft not as a monster but as a desperate, foolish man, helpless against the forces of the storm and the quiet intelligence of the network, was a liberation all its own. The power had shifted. Now, Jedediah breathed, the moment the last of Croft's party had gone. Now is our chance. They broke from the cover of the cotton bales, their heads bent low against the relentless wind, and began to move toward Pier 4. The wooden planks were slick with rain and algae, and the ship, the North Star, loomed above them, a dark, groaning beast. The gangplank was steep and narrow, glistening wetly in the gloom. They were halfway down the length of the pier, the ship almost within reach, when their luck ran out. Two figures emerged from the shelter of a small dock office at the head of their pier. City patrolmen. They had been taking shelter from the worst of the storm and had stepped out at the exact wrong moment. They stood directly between Abel and the gangplank, their path to the ship completely blocked. They were trapped. Abel's heart plummeted. After everything, to be caught now so close was a cruelty beyond imagining. He felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled his knees. Beside him, Jedediah went utterly still. Abel saw the Quaker's mind working, his calm face a mask of intense concentration, even in the midst of the gale. There was no way to go around them, and to turn back was to invite suspicion and pursuit. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, Jedediah acted. He gave Abel's arm a single hard shove, a silent command to stay put in the shadows. Then he deliberately stumbled toward a nearby stack of empty barrels. With a grunt, he pushed a small empty crate from the top of a stack. It landed on the wooden pier with a loud, echoing crash, a sound sharp enough to cut through the dull roar of the storm. As the two patrolmen instinctively turned their heads toward the noise, their hands going to their clubs, Jedediah stepped out of the shadows and into the faint light. He threw his arms wide, a caricature of drunken imbalance. "Officers!" he bellowed. His voice, usually so calm and gentle, now a loud, slurring parody of a wealthy merchant deep in his cups. "Thank the heavens. I seem to have misplaced my hotel. And my dignity." He staggered toward them, a foolish, disarming grin on his face. The patrolmen, their suspicion turning to simple annoyance, moved to intercept him. "All right there, old man," one of them said, his voice gruff. "Let's not make a scene." "A scene?" Jedediah roared with false laughter, a haunting, terrible sound. "My good man, I am the scene." He then turned and began to stumble away from them, but in the opposite direction of the ship, leading them on a chase down the pier and back toward the labyrinth of the wharf. "I believe my establishment was somewhere over here," he shouted, deliberately drawing them further and further away from Abel, away from the North Star. Abel watched, frozen for a second in horrified, powerless disbelief. He understood in that instant the magnitude of what Jedediah was doing. The Quaker was not just creating a diversion. He was sacrificing himself. He was a known associate of abolitionists, a man whose face was familiar to the authorities. To be caught out in this storm acting in such a manner would invite scrutiny, arrest, and interrogation. He was knowingly, willingly walking into the lion's den to save him. The weight of the debt Abel now owed was a crushing physical thing. The sound of Jedediah's false booming laughter echoed in his ears as he finally broke from his paralysis. He used the precious, priceless seconds that Jedediah was buying him with his own freedom. He ran. He ran with a desperation he had never known, his feet pounding on the wet planks, the wind tearing at his clothes, the rain stinging his face like 1,000 tiny needles. He didn't look back. He couldn't bear to. He reached the gangplank and scrambled up its treacherous incline, his hands grabbing the wet rope railing, his heart a wild, terrified bird in his chest, the sound of his friend's sacrifice a ghostly echo behind him. A rough hand grabbed the collar of his shirt, hauling him the last few feet onto the deck. The man was a sailor, his face a mask of grim urgency, barely visible in the storm's chaos. There were no words of welcome, no questions. There was no time. "In here!" the sailor growled, his voice a low rumble against the wind's scream. He half dragged, half shoved Abel toward an open hatch leading down into the ship's belly. The darkness below was absolute, a gaping maw that promised to swallow him whole. He stumbled down a short, steep ladder, his feet landing on an uneven surface. Before his eyes could even begin to adjust, the sailor was pushing him forward deeper into the hold. The air was thick and cloying, a foul cocktail of damp cotton, sticky sweet molasses, and the sour, stagnant stench of bilge water. It was the smell of confinement, a stark contrast to the wild, rain-washed air on deck. The sailor guided him through a narrow, treacherous path between towering stacks of cotton bales and heavy, groaning barrels of molasses. "Get in," the man commanded, pointing to a small, impossibly tight space between a wall of crates and the curved hull of the ship. "Don't make a sound. Don't move. You're not here. You don't exist until the captain says you do." Abel squeezed himself into the gap, the rough wood of the crates scraping his back, the cold, damp curve of the hull pressing against his chest. It was a coffin-like space, constricting his every breath. He was a large man, and the fit was brutally tight, his shoulders and hips wedged into place. The sailor gave a single sharp nod, then disappeared, his footsteps receding. A moment later, the heavy hatch slammed shut above, and the world was plunged into a darkness so profound, so total, that it felt like a physical weight. The last sliver of the storm-tossed world was gone, replaced by a sensory deprivation that was both a relief and a new kind of terror. He was alone, alone with the sounds of the ship and his own ragged breathing. He could hear the frantic shouts of the crew on the deck above, muffled and distorted by the thick wood. He heard the sharp, clanging ring of the ship's bell, a sound that seemed to signal not a departure, but his own funeral. Then he felt it, a deep, resonant groan that seemed to travel up from the very keel of the ship, through the floorboards, and into his bones. It was the sound of immense tension, of a great beast straining at its leash. It was followed by a sudden jarring lurch, a sideways motion that threw him hard against the hull. The ship was moving. They were casting off. The reality of it was overwhelming. He was on the water. He was moving away from Charleston, away from Croft, away from the forge, away from the only life he had ever known. The claustrophobic darkness, the foul air, the crushing proximity of the cargo. It was all secondary to that one singular, electrifying fact. He was free from the land. The terror of his flight, the sacrifice of Jedediah, the fear of capture. It all coalesced into this one moment of terrifying, triumphant motion. He pressed his face against the cold, weeping wood of the hull, and for the first time since he had walked into the smoke, he allowed himself to tremble, not from fear, but from the sheer disbelieving relief of being underway. The relative calm of the harbor was a brief, deceptive respite, as the North Star cleared the protective embrace of the coastline and met the open sea. The full, untamed fury of the storm struck it like a fist. The gentle rocking turned into a violent, sickening heave and pitch. Abel was no longer simply confined. He was being brutalized by his confinement. One moment he felt a terrifying weightlessness as the ship crested a massive wave, his body lifting from the floor, and the next, he was slammed down with bone-jarring force as it plunged into the trough. The world became a symphony of violent sound. The ship itself seemed to be screaming, its timbers groaning and creaking in a constant, high-pitched agony, as if it were being torn apart. The sound of the waves crashing against the hull was no longer a distant boom, but a series of deafening, explosive impacts that reverberated directly through his body. It sounded like cannon fire, like the world was ending just inches from his face. The cargo, his silent companions in the dark, became a deadly threat. The massive cotton bales shifted with every roll, their immense weight threatening to crush him. The barrels of molasses groaned and strained against their ropes, their deep, resonant thudding a constant, menacing drumbeat. A profound, debilitating seasickness rose up from the pit of his stomach. His body, accustomed to the solid, unyielding ground of the forge, was in open rebellion against this new, violent, fluid reality. A cold sweat broke out across his skin and his stomach churned with a nausea so intense it felt like he was being poisoned. He fought against it, clenching his jaw, his fists, every muscle in his body, but the relentless, chaotic motion of the sea was an unbeatable foe. He was violently ill in the suffocating darkness, the act of final, wretched purging of the land of Charleston of his former life. It was a baptism of the most brutal kind, a trial by water to match his trial by fire. Fear, cold and absolute, began to creep in. He was trapped, helpless, a rat in a wooden box being tossed about by a merciless god. He feared the ship would not survive, that it would be splintered into 1,000 pieces by the storm's rage, and he would be sent to the bottom of the ocean, his brief taste of freedom a final, bitter irony. He reached into his pocket, his numb fingers fumbling for the small wooden bird Sarah had given him. He pulled it out, its simple, smooth shape a single point of focus in the violent sensory chaos. He clutched it in his fist, its edges digging into his palm, an anchor in the tempest. He closed his eyes, though the darkness was the same, and focused on the feel of the bird, on Sarah's words, on Jedediah's sacrifice. He had to survive this. He owed it to them. He endured the storm hour by agonizing hour, a physical and psychological ordeal that stripped him down to his very core, leaving him utterly spent, but also in a strange way, cleansed. He didn't know if he had slept or passed out, but he was awakened by a profound change. Silence. The violent groaning of the ship had subsided to a gentle creaking. The deafening roar of the storm had been replaced by the soft, rhythmic slap of water against the hull. And then, light. A brilliant, blinding rectangle of it appeared above him as the hatch was thrown open. The daylight was a physical blow, and he squeezed his eyes shut against the pain of it. A figure was silhouetted against the bright opening, a man looking down into the hold. "All right," a gruff voice called out. "You can come out now. The worst of it's over." Slowly, painfully, Abel extricated himself from his cramped prison. Every muscle in his body ached with a deep, profound soreness from being braced against the storm's violence. He was filthy, exhausted, and unsteady on his feet, but he was alive. He stumbled toward the ladder and began to climb, his ascent slow and clumsy. When his head emerged into the light, he paused, blinking, his eyes struggling to adjust. The man standing before him was the ship's captain, Silas. He was not a large man, but he was solid, with a weathered face that looked like it had been carved from a piece of old oak and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He looked Abel up and down, his expression unreadable. "Jedediah said you were a big one," he grunted. He extended a hand. "Come on, then. Earn your keep." Silas helped him onto the deck, and Abel took his first breath of free air. It was clean and sharp and tasted of salt and sky. It filled his lungs, a cool, cleansing draft that seemed to wash away the last of the foul, stagnant air of the hold, the last of the smoke of Charleston. The sky above was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sea, which had been his tormentor, was now a vast, sparkling expanse of deep indigo, rolling in gentle, hypnotic swells. The sheer, unending vastness of it was both intimidating and profoundly liberating. There were no walls here, no boundaries, only the endless horizon in every direction. It was a moment of rebirth. "Jedediah paid for your passage," Silas said, his voice direct and businesslike. "But he didn't pay for you to be idle. On my ship, a man is judged by the work of his hands, not the color of his skin. You'll earn your keep." He handed Abel a coil of rope. "This rigging was frayed in the storm. You know how to splice a rope?" Abel shook his head. His hands knew iron and fire, not hemp and knots. "Then you'll learn," Silas said simply. He also gave him a bucket and a brush and set him to work swabbing the salt-crusted decks. The work was alien to him. His muscles, conditioned by the heavy rhythmic work of the hammer, ached with the new, unfamiliar movements of scrubbing and rope mending. But it was a good ache, an honest ache. It was the ache of labor freely given, not brutally extracted. He learned the rhythms of the ship, the language of the sails and the tides. He learned the names of the ropes and the stars. He worked alongside the other sailors, a small, rough crew of men from all corners of the world. Most kept their distance, not out of malice, but out of a professional reserve. But one, a young Irish sailor named Finn, sought him out. Finn was wiry and pale, with a shock of red hair and eyes that held a haunted, knowing look. He had a quick smile, but it never quite reached his eyes. He had escaped the great famine in his homeland, a different kind of bondage, a slavery to hunger and poverty. He saw in Abel a kindred spirit. "We all be running from something, eh?" Finn said to him one afternoon as they mended a sail together, his Irish lilt a musical counterpoint to the cry of the gulls. "The crown, the hunger, the master. It's all the same boot on your neck." He paused, his needle moving with practiced speed. "The trick is to find something worth running to." Days later, the ship sailed on a calm sea under a benevolent sun. The trauma of the storm had faded, leaving behind the quiet, steady routine of the voyage. Abel stood at the ship's rail as the sun began to set, painting the western sky in brilliant bleeding colors of orange, red, and purple. He found himself looking south, back in the direction they had come, though Charleston was long gone, vanished over the curve of the earth. He thought of the people he had left behind, the faces that now existed only in his memory. He thought of Ilara, her quiet strength, her weary, loving eyes. He wondered if she was safe, if Croft's rage had fallen upon her. He thought of Sarah, her sharp intelligence, her calm courage, and the small wooden bird that was still safely tucked in his pocket. Most of all, he thought of Jedediah. He saw the Quaker's face, his false, booming laugh echoing in his memory as he deliberately walked into the arms of the patrol. The weight of that sacrifice was a constant, heavy presence in his heart. His freedom had been bought at the price of another man's. He did not know if he would ever find out what happened to them, if they were safe, if they were even alive. He was no longer just running away from the fire of the forge. He was carrying the hopes of the people who had pushed him toward the sea. His own survival was no longer enough. His freedom was a debt that he had to repay. The joy of his escape was real, a profound and powerful thing, but it was tempered by the deep, bittersweet melancholy of what had been lost and what had been sacrificed for it. The sunset painted the sky in the colors of fire and blood, a last fading memory of Charleston, a final silent farewell to the man he had been. He turned his face to the north toward the unknown, toward the horizon where his new life was waiting. The ship docked not with a sudden halt, but with a slow, grinding surrender to the land. The transition from the endless rolling blue to the hard, unyielding reality of the Philadelphia docks was a shock to the system. The noise hit Abel first, a physical wave of sound so complex and overwhelming it made the clang of his old forge seem like a whisper. It was a cacophony of 1,000 different lives being lived at once. The shouts of vendors, the rumble of countless wagon wheels on stone, the sharp clang of bells, the neighing of horses, and underneath it all, a constant humming river of human voices speaking in a dozen accents and languages. It was the sound of a world in relentless motion. He stood on the deck of the North Star, clutching the rail, his knuckles white, a man standing on the shore of a new world. The sheer number of people was a dizzying spectacle, a swarm of humanity that moved with a purpose and energy he had never witnessed. And then he saw it. The sight that made his breath catch in his throat and his heart hammer against his ribs. Black men and women everywhere. They were not shuffling with downcast eyes or moving under the watchful gaze of an overseer. They were walking with purpose, their heads held high. A black man in a fine coat argued passionately with a white merchant over a bill of lading. A group of black women, their laughter ringing out bright and clear in the morning air, haggled over a basket of vegetables. A black drayman directed the loading of his own wagon, his voice a confident bark of authority. It was an impossibility, a scene from a dream he would not have dared to have. This was the promise of the North made real, and it was more vibrant, more chaotic, and more terrifyingly beautiful than he could have ever imagined. He felt his sea legs, so steady on the rolling deck, turn to water beneath him. He walked down the gangplank on unsteady limbs, each step a conscious, deliberate act. When his boots touched the solid ground of the pier, a jolt went through him. He was a free man setting foot on free soil for the first time, and the very earth felt different beneath him. He was anonymous here, a single unnoticed drop in an endless ocean of humanity. His past washed away, his future an unwritten page. The feeling was not just liberating, it was exhilarating, a dizzying, terrifying sense of infinite possibility. Just as he was about to be swallowed by the crowd, to disappear into the city's embrace, he heard his name called. Not Abel, the name branded on his soul, but the name he had worn for the voyage. James! Captain Silas stood by the gangplank, his oak-carved face impassive as ever, beckoning him over. Abel walked back, his heart sinking with a sudden irrational fear that something was wrong, that this was all a mistake. Silas looked him over one last time, his sea-gray eyes holding a flicker of something Abel couldn't quite decipher. The captain reached into his coat and pulled out a small, heavy pouch made of thick leather, its drawstring pulled tight. He pressed it firmly into Abel's hand. "You earned it, son," Silas said, his voice a low grumble. "This is your own. Now go make a life with it." Abel looked down at the pouch, confused. He loosened the drawstring and tilted it, and a cascade of metal coins tumbled into his palm. They were copper and silver, worn smooth by 1,000 other hands, but they shone in the morning sun like precious jewels. It was his wages. His wages for the work he had done on the voyage, for splicing the ropes and swabbing the decks and helping mend the sails. It was the first money he had ever earned in his entire life. The concept was so alien, so revolutionary that his mind struggled to grasp it. His labor, his sweat, his time, it had always belonged to Master Croft. It was a resource to be extracted from him like iron from the earth. The idea that his work had a value that belonged to him, that could be translated into these solid, tangible coins in his hand, was a revelation that shook him to his core. The weight of the coins was monumental. It was heavier than any hammer he had ever lifted, heavier than the iron gate he had perfected on his last night of bondage. It was the weight of personhood. It was proof, solid and real, that he was his own man. This simple, crude transaction, a handful of coins for a few weeks of work, was a more profound affirmation of his freedom than any document, any storm, any distance. He closed his fist around the coins, the metal cool and hard against his skin. He looked up at Silas, his throat too thick with emotion to speak. He could only nod, a deep and solemn gesture of gratitude. Silas simply grunted, gave a curt nod in return, and turned away to bellow an order at one of his crewmen. The transaction was over. Abel stood for a long moment on the bustling dockside, the chaos of Philadelphia swirling around him, and stared at the first thing in the world that was truly his. Months passed. The dizzying shock of Philadelphia slowly gave way to a new, hard-won familiarity. Abel found lodging in a small room in a boarding house run by a stern but fair Quaker widow, a contact provided by Jedediah's far-reaching network. He found work, odd jobs at first, hauling cargo on the same docks he had landed on, his immense strength making him a valuable hand. He was quiet, kept to himself, and listened more than he spoke, learning the rhythms and dangers of this new life. He saved every possible coin, the small pouch growing heavier week by week. But his hands, those master blacksmith's hands, felt idle and useless. They missed the familiar weight of the hammer, the creative heat of the forge. Through the network, he eventually heard of a community of free black tradesmen in a district near the Delaware River, a place where a man's skill was his currency. He sought them out and found a small, busy smithy run by an old, grizzled smith named Hezekiah. The old man's eyes were sharp, and when he looked at Abel's hands, he saw not a common laborer, but a man who knew the fire. He gave Abel a trial, asking him to forge a simple set of hinges. Abel stood before a forge again. He picked up a hammer. The tool felt like an extension of his own arm, a part of him he had lost and now reclaimed. He took the glowing iron from the fire and laid it on the anvil. The first time he struck it, the sound, that familiar deafening clang, rang through the shop. It was the same sound that had been the soundtrack to his enslavement, but the feeling was entirely, fundamentally different. The fire was his to command, not his master's. The iron was his to shape for his own purpose, not for another man's profit. The heat of this forge was not oppressive, it was creative. The clang of the hammer was not a sound of bondage, it was a song of freedom. A passion he had never been allowed to feel surged through him. He worked with a fire and a skill that stunned the old smith. The simple hinges he produced were perfectly balanced, flawlessly crafted. His skill, honed in the crucible of Croft's cruelty, quickly earned him respect and then a permanent place at Hezekiah's side. He was home. One evening after he had saved enough money, he sought out the quiet Quaker woman who was his link to the world he had left behind. He gave her a small sum of money and a simple coded message to be sent south. "The North Star has landed." He was no longer just a recipient of aid. He was now a part of the chain, a signal of hope, a confirmation that the path to freedom, though fraught with peril, was real. Several years passed. The smithy by the river was no longer Hezekiah's, it was Abel's. The old man had passed on, leaving his prized forge and his good name to the man he called his finest student. Abel was older now, his face lined with the experience of a life fully lived, the soot of the forge etched into his skin like a second memory. But his eyes, once haunted and guarded, were now clear and calm. He was a master of his craft, his work known and respected throughout the city. The great front door of his smithy, unlike the one in Charleston, was always thrown wide open, letting in the light and the constant reassuring breeze from the sea. The air inside was a familiar, comforting mix of coal smoke and salt, the scent he had once dreamed of as the smell of escape, but which he now knew as the smell of home. One late afternoon, as the light began to fade, a young couple appeared in the open doorway. They were little more than children, their clothes ragged, their faces etched with a bone-deep terror and exhaustion that Abel recognized in his own soul. They were runaways, their eyes wide with the fear of the hunted. Abel put down his hammer, his expression softening. He said nothing, but simply gestured for them to come in, to come toward the warmth of the forge fire. He brought them bread and a ladle of cool water, and as they huddled in the back of the shop, devouring the simple meal, he spoke to them in low, reassuring tones, giving them directions further north, to the next safe harbor on their journey. He gave the young man a few coins, the weight of them a familiar, empowering feeling. After they had gone, melting back into the city's shadows with a renewed flicker of hope in their eyes, Abel turned back to his work. He finished the piece he was working on, a simple, sturdy anchor for a local fisherman. At the end of his day, he looked out the wide, open door at the sea, watching the last light of day paint the water in hues of gold and gray. He had fulfilled Sarah's charge. He had built a nest, a strong one, a place of warmth and safety for others who were flying free. He turned from the sea, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he took off his heavy leather apron. He folded it neatly, the worn leather soft and pliable in his hands. He placed it gently on his anvil, a final, quiet act at the end of a day's work freely done, in a life freely lived. The folded apron, once a symbol of his defiant departure from bondage, was now a symbol of peace, of purpose, and of a promise kept. The cycle of liberation continued,